6 this morning, beginning with, it's a familiar passage, and I'm going to cut it short because I want to focus on one part of it. This is the feeding of the 5,000. It says in Mark chapter 6, beginning with verse 34, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them. Nicholas, to do him due diligence, I don't think this is justice. I think it's actually compassion, because it was a feeling, it was a sense that he had toward them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Notice how compassion corresponds not with just practical needs, but with actual formation. And that's what we're going to see in the next lines. And when it was already quite late, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and it is already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." It's an important distinction between rights and responsibilities. We hear a lot about human rights, but frankly, evangelicals don't do very well with the concept of rights before God. We don't know that anybody has any rights before God. But we do want to talk about responsibilities, and there are two strains that are going on in our nation today and in our churches, quite frankly. As a pastor, I hear these voices all of the time, and they are the competing values, the competing moral values of individual responsibility and caring for those who have a lack in their life. What is the group response? What is the responsibility of the follower of Jesus to address this problem? Should we just send them away and say, let them fend for themselves? Or do we have a responsibility to actually follow the words of Jesus, not be caught up in the abdication of an overwhelming and seemingly impossible challenge that is many times the cause to say, well, it's not our business anyhow. I'm reading this great book, this Exodus from Hunger book, and it reminds us that there's a strain in our country of this rugged individualism, this everyone is responsible for himself. And in chapter 5, he quotes Ralph Waldo Emerson arguing for the principle of self-reliance against charity as a matter of principle. And this is a quote from Emerson. "Do not tell me, as a good man did today, of my obligation to all poor men in good situations. Are they my poor? I tell thee that thou foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent I give to such man as do not belong to me, to whom I do not belong. Indeed, am I my brother's keeper?" This is the ancient voice, and this is the ancient escape, and this is the ancient abdication of responsibility. The disciples thought that they were being compassionate, thought that they were trying to provide by letting them fend for themselves. Let them go. Send them away. And let them figure it out. It'll be better for them. They'll have more to eat, because certainly we can't do this. But Jesus had another idea, because there is this strain in our country that comes from the gospel. And that is, it is our responsibility somehow to set a process going whereby in certain circumstances we can be of assistance. You have more than you think you do. You have more capability to provide for this means than you possibly could think that you have. You give them something to eat. And by the way, Scott, this you is plural. It wasn't to individuals. It was you figure it out together. We heard last night, Carol tell us about all of the different kinds of philanthropy, all of the different sources. There are faith-based and government and profit and nonprofit and individual philanthropy and indigenous arising philanthropies and so on and so forth. This is what Jesus was saying. You've got to figure it out together. Have this in your mind. First of all, we are always for the underdog. I remember watching every Saturday night with my grandfather. We would have a ritual where my sister and I would go to my grandmother and grandfather's house, and we would go to church with my grandmother the next day. But on Saturday night, we would watch first Lawrence Welk. Some of you are old enough to remember Lawrence Welk. And then they had the Gillette Saturday Night Fights on, which I would watch with my grandfather. And we had this ritual every Saturday night. I'd say, Pop, who are we rooting for? And he said, well, the guy in the black trunks or the guy in the white trunks. So I'd say, why are we rooting for him? And he'd say, well, he's the underdog. Joey, we always root for the underdog. Well, there's a whole scripture here that's always rooting for the underdog. You know, God chooses a nation as his people, who's the underdog nation. Jesus comes down and he preaches the gospel to the poor. He sets the captives free. He's rooting for the underdog. This is the strain. This is the prophetic strain in our faith. And so this is where we have to go with this. You give them something to eat. You figure it out together. In all your various venues, you have to cooperate. I have given you this problem that is so overwhelming, no particular group can do it themselves. And so you have to figure it out together. I'm married to a biologist, and one day she was giving me a stirring lecture on plant reproduction. I just can't tell you how excited I was to hear about it. And she said, Hunter, do you know how plants reproduce? And I said, well, honey, I can't say as I do. And she said, well, there's two ways. Plants can reproduce themselves. You know, those of you in biology know this. They have the capability of pollinating themselves. And that certainly is the most convenient and the most frequent form of reproduction, is that they pollinate themselves. And then there is another method whereby you get another plant that is a ways away, that is enough like this plant to reproduce with this plant, but different enough to have a different gene set, to have a different set of genetics. And you get a means of carrying that pollen, whether it be bee or wind or whatever it is. And then you have a hybrid plant, and that's called cross-pollination. So I said, help me here. And she said, well, even though self-pollination is the most expedient and the most frequent, there's a problem, because you're locked into one set of genes, which means it'll thrive okay as long as the environment stays exactly the same. But if you get outside that environment, then it's going to have a problem. But if you have cross-pollination and there is a hybrid, then the sustainability, the survivability of that plant is much increased, no matter what happens with the change that is going on around outside. I think that's what's happening today in the church. We understand we have to work with others. We have to. This is a comprehensive approach, and if it's not a comprehensive approach, then it will be a short-lived approach, because everything's changing very fast. And so we have to partner with people who have strengths that we don't have. We have to address not only food, but we have to address shelter. We have to address employment. We have to address support systems so that people can keep that employment. We have to address health. We have to address all of these things. And so therefore there's this kind of cross-pollinating activity. Now, here's the good news. Two things are really going to help us in this journey. First of all, every time they flash that sign, the least of these, you know, they have these darling kids. Every time I go on a mission trip, Beck said, "How many kids are you going to come back with?" She's just afraid I'm going to, because whoever wants to not help children? And so feed the hungry children, absolutely. Absolutely. There's nobody who's, let them fend for themselves, you know. We all have a heart for children, no matter what station of life that you're in. I was telling some folks last night that some of you know I have a pastoral relationship with President Obama, and it's too providential and personal to explain, but in one of my prayer times with him, we were going through something together, and he said, "I'd like to meet your family sometime." So a couple of weeks ago, we took our grandchildren into the Oval Office, which, by the way, is the definition of ambivalence, taking grandchildren into the Oval Office. But I wish you could have seen his face when he was with my grandchildren. I mean, I've seen his reaction to a lot of different things, seen his face in a lot of different circumstances. But there was something in his face that happened with children that just, and I suspect, I didn't know W as well as Michael, but he would have had the exact same reaction, because that's the reaction all of us have. And so the point here is we've got this universal, evocative cause that is biblically mandated. You give them something to eat. But here is where I, as a pastor, and that's my role. That will always be my role. I love to be in a room full of advocates. I love to be in a room full of, somebody called themselves policy wonks. That is so needed, and I am so not that. But I got to tell you, as a pastor, my heart is for the spiritual maturity of my congregation. And I don't have a great enthusiasm about the direction of the American church these days, at least the way it's advertised in the media. I think that many of us have come to think of church as therapy. Many of us have come to think of church as self-actualization exercises. Many of us have come to think of church as somehow the place where we are gratified and affirmed in our own path. And there's all kinds of sick gospels out there, the prosperity gospel being one of the sickest. And I have great fears for my church. I have great fears for my country when I hear much of the conversation being, how much of my money can I keep? That being the goal, because it's my right to keep all of my money. That just as a pastor, it just says there is a spiritual alarm going off that says we are so on the wrong path here. And so, as a pastor, this kind of conversation, when I see this kind of mandate in Scripture, I say, and believe me, these people are in my congregation too. They hear these same voices on the radio. We just went through Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University. 3,000 of my congregation went through that. And part of that's good because we are so wasteful in our spending. We are not good stewards. We need to have training in the discipline of stewardship. But this little voice that comes out that says, I can have more money now. I can have more freedom. I can have more security. I can have more of my own stash. You know, this is the original temptation. You can be like God, you know, knowing you can have your own stash. You don't need to trust him anymore. You don't need to go to him anymore. There's that original temptation that just keeps coming back to us. And I see it in my congregation. And I keep thinking, There's a cure for that. There's a cure for that. And what we're involved in is the cure. Let me close with this story. Pastors love to tell stories. And I heard a story a long time ago that just really stuck with me. It's a legend about this Indian tribe that was camped by the river a long time ago in America, and many tribes, if they were agriculture, if they're not warring tribes, camped by rivers for obvious reasons. It was a source of food. It was a source of cleanliness. It was a source, of course, of water, and so on and so forth. And this particular river only had a couple of times a year when it flooded. I mean, the current was so rapid that anybody wandering into that river would quickly be swept downstream. And so there was a rainy season, and then there was the spring season when this river just was in flood stage, and the current was very rapid. And it was during one of these seasons that this particular tribe was attacked by a very fierce rival tribe. And they fought all day, and it was very apparent that they were going to be defeated and very likely either taken into slavery or slaughtered. But night fell, and in that day and in that time, Indians didn't fight at night. And so they had one more night to figure out what they were going to do. And around the campfire were the warriors that were left, but also the rest of the tribe, the children, and the old, and the sick, and the weak. And the chief said, it seems like we have basically two alternatives here. One is that we will all die together tomorrow in battle. And the other is that maybe a few of you warriors would be strong enough to try to get across that river. And if you could, then at least a small part of our tribe would survive. Well, the second alternative seemed to be the most logical. It seemed to be, until the warriors stood up and they took a look around that campfire, and they knew they couldn't leave. They couldn't leave and try to survive on their own. So this is what they did. Every one of those warriors picked up as much as they could carry in those that were left. They took children. They took the old. They took the sick. And they put them on their shoulders, and they waded out into that river. And they figured, if we're going to die together. We will not die by the hand of our enemies. We will die together. Not one of them died, because the weight of the weak saved the strong. There was an accusation hurled at Jesus on the cross. He saved others. He cannot save himself. That was true enough for the cross, but it wasn't true for the tomb. The church needs the weight of the weak, because without it, we will be swept downstream in the currents of the world. The weight of the weak will save the strong. Pray with me. Lord, let us not give in to our lesser voices, those that seem reasonable, those that even seem compassionate. If they ever are to survive, we need to send them away and let them figure it out for themselves. Let us hear your voice. You all together give them something to eat. You all together use what you have, where you are, however you can, and watch what I do with the rest. Give us that responsibility. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you so much. Welcome to day 2. It was an exciting day. And that was even before the storms came. I don't know about you, but I really found much to think about. Much opportunity to connect the mission of the church and the responsibility of the nation. Much opportunity to wrestle with Scripture and to hear what new insights the Spirit might be leading me to. And I hope the same was the experience for you. The other experience of the day that I have to acknowledge, and I really want to on behalf of all of us, was the experience of that wonderful Christian virtue of hospitality. Yeah. I don't think I've ever felt so well cared for as I did last night. And to Dr. Cook and to Jay and to Tommy and to everyone else from DBU, I want to say thank you for the wonderful way that you've welcomed us and cared for our needs and physically protected us while we've been here. I also like to just acknowledge the partnership that has brought us all together, partnership with the Christian Life Commission, with the Christian Reformed World, CRWRC, with the National Association of Evangelicals, and Bread for the World, and Micah Challenge. It's a good partnership for all of us, and I think we're all growing together as we more and more appreciate the work that each other has been doing. I also want to take this opportunity to make one other expression of thanks, and that is, this would not have happened if it weren't for the work of Chris Ann Valancourt Murphy. Chris Ann and Dulce Gabo, where's Dulce? Working, there she is. Have really put together every piece of this puzzle, and I know you have seen their names come flying by on many emails. I'm really thankful for the way that they have really brought us together and created this time when we can learn and grow together. One other thing I wanted to do is, can you put that up for me? Thank you. Last night, David mentioned the circle of protection, and those of us who are concerned about what is happening to poor and hungry people around the world and in our own country are particularly concerned about what's happening in our nation's capital as this new budget is being put together, as we're struggling to deal with debt and the deficits in the coming years. The Circle of Protection is a way that a number of us have come together to call on our leaders as they make difficult decisions to make sure that we protect the programs that are essential to poor and vulnerable people. And I just wanted you to see the folks who have come together to form that Circle of Protection. It's great representation of the breadth of the church and our ability to speak with one voice. And I really invite your prayers over the coming weeks and months that this circle of protection is strong and that it holds and that our voices are heard. We're in day 2 of our time together. We have much more to hear, many more voices, a couple of times to be in our small groups today to kind of process our own thoughts and think about our own way forward in this task of making sure that the children who God loves, those children, have something to eat. And we invite your full participation and your enthusiastic participation as we work through this day. So, let us begin, and let us enjoy one another's company and the goodness of this place and this wonderful hospitality. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chad Hayward. I'm the executive director of Accord, which is a network of about 70 relief and development organizations, all committed to empowering the Christian community to end poverty. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. JoAnne Lyon. It's just a thrill for me to be able to introduce someone who I truly admire. And I got to know JoAnne in 2003 when I'd first taken a job with USAID, and it was my responsibility to get to know and do outreach to any faith-based group we could find. And I met hundreds upon hundreds of faith-based groups, all beating down our door looking for federal funding, hoping I had a checkbook in my drawer. And JoAnne became one of my first friends there, and we were really looking for new entrants into the federal process, groups who had not received federal money before that point. It was a really tough job to find those with enough capacity and the right strategy to be able to do holistic work and still be true to their faith. And we'd always warn them, make sure you be careful how much work you want to do with the U.S. government. The most impressive thing, though, is that JoAnne's group, World Hope International, was the group that we started heralding as our best example of a new entrant. Amazingly, though, it wasn't an old group that just never received federal funding. World Hope started in 1996 in JoAnne's spare room in her house. And she went from there in 96 to in the 2000s, multi-million dollars of aid going to the poor with federal funding. I have a couple spare rooms in my house. It's kind of convicting. But she also has 30 years prior experience in administering domestic, urban, and rural human service programs, as well as local church ministries. And I'd say also that she finds favor with whoever she meets, from her denomination to her donors, to the White House, to USAID, to State Department, to universities. She holds 5 honorary degrees from different universities. But I close with what World Hope says about her. They say she has a simple yet profound vision to not just help people around the world in need, but to empower the poorest of the poor so they can be agents of change in their own communities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. JoAnne Lyon.
Thank you. Let's see, I'll pull this down a little bit, a little shorter here. Great to be with you this morning. And my topic is the church as agent and advocate. It's been my privilege to be on the Bread for the World board for 6 years. So I'm no longer on it now. We have terms, and so my term is over. But it was a great opportunity to serve with David. I think David is one of the finest leaders and people, a God person in our country today, and I'm grateful to have been grateful to work with him. And I also was encouraged yesterday with Scott's presentation and David's presentation of hope. You know, this can be done. I remember one time being someplace and Kay Warren said, I want to see HIV/AIDS ended in my lifetime, and I happened to be on a human trafficking piece at that time, and I said, I want to see it ended in my lifetime, human trafficking ended in my lifetime, and we both decided that everyone needs to get busy fast because we're both old. But it is great hope that we have. And when we're doing the work of God, there is that hope, and there is that added power that's there that we heard from Joel's wonderful presentation this morning of when we step out and you feed them, and we know the rest of the story, what Jesus did in that. And he adds to that. And I also appreciated Dr. Woltersdorf's great depth of work yesterday, and also the others as they then gave expressions of living all of that out. I've admired Dr. Woltersdorf's writings for many years, and so it was great to hear you yesterday. As we look at the church, and now I have another position. I have been elected as the head of the denomination of the Wesleyan Church. And so not long ago, someone, 3 years ago, had asked me to come to speak for a conference when I was still with World Hope. And so I called them the other day and I said, "Are you sure you really want me? You really want me? Because when you asked me to come to speak for your conference, I was with World Hope and doing a lot of exciting things. Now I'm nothing but a boring church bureaucrat. And do you really want me?" They said, "Oh, yes. We think we still do. So we'll see what happens after I'm there." But this is where church is called today, agent and advocate. And I also want to talk this morning a bit about issues of structural injustice and structural evil that we need to deal with. I believe the brother from CCDA yesterday was asking a question that had to do with how do we deal with structural things that keep people oppressed. And God's called us to that as well. I will never forget walking into a center in Sierra Leone, West Africa, Freetown, the capital city, during the war. Many of you have seen the movie Blood Diamonds, and so you're aware of what took place in those days. And Peter lived some of his life in that area, Peter Vandermeulen, and so he knows very well what I'm talking about. We worked very closely in the country of Sierra Leone. I was in and out during those days of the war and worked with the amputees, etc. But I remember walking into a building, a church building. It was a Wesleyan church building that this group of people in Freetown, Sierra Leone, had turned their building into a therapeutic feeding center. And I walked in that church building that day and saw these children, these babies with pencil-thin arms, and trying to grasp a bit of milk from their mother's breast, the sagging, dry breasts that were there. And as I went through the building, and my heart was breaking as I was seeing what was happening, but at the same time, the people that were taking me through were telling me about the hope that was happening there. They'd partnered with the World Food Program and literally turned that entire sanctuary and that entire church building into a therapeutic feeding center. And there were many babies and many mothers, and they proudly then told me, "We've had a 99% success rate. We have saved the lives of mothers and babies of 99% here." Well, I was thrilled as I saw that. Well, I came back to the States, and I was telling some of the missionaries that had been there what I saw and about this particular church, and they were familiar with that church, this particular church, and what they were doing, and that they just literally turned the church into this therapeutic feeding center. The missionaries didn't get it. And they said, oh no, we are so sad because theological education, they've had to close the Bible schools. Theological education is not happening. And I said, theological education is doing. They're doing theological education. They're doing theology. And that shows, I think, many times how the church has been so compartmentalized. And as I went through and I saw much of what was taking place, the people that, yes, had learned theology, had learned had learned Scripture, but they were putting it into practice. And it's about the praxis of this that we're looking at today. Now, in the Scriptures, we find, and we've had excellent background in this, but there's something of a biblical mandate still as the church in a holistic piece. Chris Wright, of whom Cookie studied with in England, he's written a tome. Don't be impressed that you think I read all 600 pages. Probably some of you scholars in here have, but I haven't read it all, but it's very compelling. He's written this wonderful book called The Mission of God. It's a whole narrative of God from the beginning to the end. And he unpacks the meaning of the chosen people that is as extended to the relevance for the church today as God's holy people. He says practical holiness, ethical dimension meant living lives of integrity, justice, and compassion in every area, including personal, family, social, economic, and national life. He goes on to define, if we are included to think of holiness as a matter of private piety, in Christian terms, or as a matter of binding religious rituals, in Old Testament terms, then we might expect either a list of devotional exhortations for our deeper personal sanctity, or a manual of obsolete ritual regulations for our relieved abandonment. Actually, it contains none of the former and only a few of the latter. The bulk of Leviticus 19 shows us that the kind of holiness that reflects God's own holiness is thoroughly practical, social, and very down to earth. And here are just a few. Respect within the family and community. Economic generosity in agriculture. Observing the commandments regarding social relationships. Economic justice and employment rights. Social compassion to the disabled. Judicial integrity in the legal system. Sexual integrity. No ill treatment of ethnic minorities, but rather racial equality before the law and practical love for the alien as for oneself. And then we move on. Rene Padilla, who's a Latin American theologian, says, in light of the biblical teaching, there is no room for eschatological paralysis, nor for a social strike. I think this next line is a bit stunning, and it says, there is no place, and he's evangelical, by the way, there is no place for statistics on how many souls die without Christ every minute if they do not take into account how many of those who die are dying of hunger. There is no place for evangelism that passes by the man who is assaulted by thieves on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho and sees him only as a soul that must be saved. The words of James complete this thought. What does it profit, my brethren, if a man says he has faith, but has not works? Can his faith save him? If a brother or a sister is ill-clad and in lack of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving the things needed for the body, what does it profit? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. The psalmist, Psalm 82, is a very fascinating psalm. It's referred to as the court of nations. And it opens with, and I think this is where it calls nations to accountability. God presides in the great assembly. He gives judgment among the gods. How long, God says, will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Then he goes on to say, defend the cause of the weak and fatherless. Maintain the rights of the poor and oppressed. Rescue the weak and needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And then that whole psalm goes on, and the middle part says, and if you sort of don't do this, I'm going to shake the earth. There's no way around this. This is where we are as God's people, as the church as agent and as advocate. John Perkins perhaps sums it up when he says, the church is called to be the replacement of Jesus in a given community, doing what he would do, going where he would go, and teaching what he would teach. Now, I'm from the Wesleyan tradition. I know it's a little shaky here in Baptist territory, but we're all about the same purpose here. And our founding father, John Wesley, certainly believed in holistic ministry. In fact, I always love it when I'm around labor union people that talk about the fact that John Wesley started the British labor movement. That doesn't always go over well with people who are non-union, so I always try to watch where I'm using this, getting my points here. But as you know, in England, when child labor was there, and as he saw these children and 4-year-olds in the coal mines, and they were putting children far up in these tiny places because their hands were tiny and they could get into those cracks of the mines. And abomination to God, he said, and he began the British labor movement and began to do those things. Of course, he wrote the last letter to Wilberforce. The last letter that he wrote before he died was a letter to Wilberforce, encouraging him to continue his fight regarding the slave trade. And then I think it's something in that letter that is very compelling. He says, and maybe it will reach to America, the vilest of them all. Very sobering kinds of words that he said. But he saw certainly the church as agent and as advocate. And then we find from that also we find in this the Salvation Army as a part of the movement out of John Wesley's movement, out of the Methodism, and Catherine Booth, who was a co-founder of the Salvation Army. It's written that she not only spent time on the streets with the poor, but preached to royalty. She did not hesitate to lobby with Queen Victoria for changes in oppressive laws, and she fiercely castigated the wealthy for their irresponsibility to the poor. It is said that when Catherine Booth died, 50,000 people of all stratas of society in England passed by her coffin. Advocate, agent, and advocate. In this country, the Wesleyan roots are in abolition. My background is our abolitionists. We were the abolitionists. And many great stories of that. You can travel to places in Michigan and find houses that were called Wesleyan houses, where slaves were housed in the basement of the church, of their homes. And people were called, and they saw this integrated together. Abolition, church planting, all went together. There's a great story of a man by the name of Adam Crooks. Adam Crooks was a pastor in Ohio, and he felt called to go to North Carolina and plant churches and be an abolitionist. And so he did. He went to North Carolina. He planted 25 churches. So the folks who liked about church planting, that's surely a good one. But also the 25 churches that were planted, these people were also engaged in the abolitionist movement. He was tarred and feathered, hung in effigy, and finally one of his converts, the people of one of his churches decided that he'd better go back to Ohio because he was going to lose his life. So this man, he said, I'll take over everything that you've done. This is my territory. This is my country. I know what I'm doing. So Micah McPherson was his name, and so he took over the work of Adam Crooks, and Adam Crooks went back to Ohio. One night, Micah and his family heard noise outside their home, and a mob attacked him and drug him out with a large group of people out there, drug him out and proceeded to hang him. And they found an old knotty dogwood tree, and it's interesting because they shot shots into the family's home to scare them, which certainly frightened the family, and they hid in the house. And they took Micah McPherson out and put him by a dogwood tree, and they found one of the men said, this is an old knotty dogwood tree, but that's good enough to hang a Wesleyan on. And so they hung Micah McPherson on this tree. He thought he was dying, but he heard footsteps and realized that he hadn't died, and he was unconscious. And someone came along and saw that he hadn't, and he needed the noose for someone else. And he said, that old critter isn't dead yet. I'm just going to take this noose and hang someone else with it. And so he did. And while Micah McPherson responded, went back home, lived many years. And I love this part. He says, and many years after the Civil War, Micah was in a revival service and noticed a man who had slipped into the service. He recognized him as one of the lynchers. He went to the man and urged him to repent. The man recognized Micah when he was so overwhelmed that he ran from the building because he thought he had died, and there he is. And Micah lived 30 years after the Civil War, a very rich and contagious faith. But there were statements that were said in North Carolina. There were not enough nooses in North Carolina to hang all the Wesleyans. I wish that there would be something that a congressperson in Washington could say, wow, finally I've had just one day without Wesleyans, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Reformed people calling me or writing me about hunger. Could that be today? Well, the church as agent and advocate. Also in our past is women's rights. First meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, was held in the basement of a Wesleyan Methodist church because no one else would allow them. That all went together. Our faith was combined, agent and advocate. And then following this became what became known as the American Holiness Movement. And they emphasized being filled with the Holy Spirit and immediately saw their mission with the poor. Advocates and agents together. It's told a woman her name was Maddie Hoke in the 1920s in a town in Kansas, Hutchinson, Kansas. She organized groups of people to have prayer and advocate meet weekly. She did this for 6 years, actually. Prayer and advocated weekly for the poor and lowly with the politicians, in the homes of bankers and business people, and at the same time met in the homes of very poor and lowly, the sick, the dying, the county jail, the county poor farm, on the street, and in brothels. She saw laws changed as well as attitudes. Ultimately, she started a college in that town, which today is a merger with, some of you may be familiar with, Southern Nazarene University in Oklahoma City. It came out of those prayers, those advocacies for the poor in this little town in Kansas. There was a school in Cincinnati that saw its mission to educate people, but to work with the poor. And there are many, many fascinating stories that happened in Cincinnati at that time. And it became so entwined, this Bible school became so entwined in advocacy for the poor that at one point during World War II, and the city worked with buses in helping feed people, et cetera, and the police department, et cetera. And during World War II, when there were gas rations, they didn't know how the city buses were going to be able to help. And one day, they received a call from Eleanor Roosevelt to the mayor, who said, "Let the buses roll," for the name of this school was God's Bible School. "Let the buses roll for God's Bible School." They saw themselves so entwined together, working together. And in fact, this school later had some financial troubles. And the city said, "We cannot let this school go because it does too much for the city." I've often wondered today, many of our Christian educational institutions, would a city of Dallas save Dallas Baptist University? I don't know anything about your issues here, but would a city of that size save an institution because they were doing so much together for the poor and lifting the city to another level? Well, I would like to say that we in the evangelical world have continued to keep this integrated, but we didn't. And we lament this, but I believe God is calling us back. I think a watermark time was in 1973 when 50 evangelicals met in Chicago and worked together. Carl F. H. Henry was alive at that time, and several leading evangelicals. Ron Sider was able to get the funds from Lilly to be able to do this, and wrote the first evangelical declaration of social concern. I am so old that I was at the next one in 1974, very pregnant with my first child, and began to work on how are ways in which we begin to work this out. We can sign a declaration, but what really happens? How do we work this kind of thing out? And I believe that the waves are rolling in this way, and that's why we're here today. And this is the work of God. And as David said so powerfully last night, God is active in this, and He's asking us to join Him in this activity. Well, what about partnership with government, yet maintaining an identity of faith? I think, as Chad mentioned, it's important that we do this. We must, regarding funds, but also government is responsible. There's a very interesting book that has just been written about a year ago by Lou Daly, who's a senior fellow at DEMOS, which is a nonpartisan public policy research and advocacy organization. This book is called God's Economy. And actually, it's a new conversation on this intersection. And he frees the conversation from the narrow culture war framework. He makes a strong case, and I don't know if Michael Gerson is in here or not, but Michael probably is familiar with this. But he makes a strong case for the influence of the Christian faith in the public square and convincingly argues this religious framework gives a moral coherence that goes deeper than politics. He goes on to argue their cooperation where responsibilities overlap. For example, providing assistance to the poor, which is a legitimate responsibility of both the state. A state is legitimately responsible for this. It is charged with securing the common welfare. And the church is charged with serving the least among us because they are children of God. Do you see this together? A state is charged with this. You can go through history, and a state that does not provide for its poor collapses. And so but we as the people of God are charged with serving the least among us because they are children of God. And so this is where we work together. Now, as I look at where we are today, and as has already been mentioned regarding the whole issue of advocacy and our budgets and so forth, and I'm very grateful for David's call for prayer and the prayer and fasting that he has done, and many people who have joined him in this, in Tony Hall, in this group. This also happens because of prayer. When you look at the abolitionist movement, most people didn't hide slaves in their basement, but there were huge amounts of prayer. When you look at the Clapham group and the 24-hour, 24/7 prayer that went on, it is through that God does break through in this. So I want to really urge us in this kind of thing. And in the all of these pieces that we're talking about, prayer was a mandate. Prayer began to make this take place because this is God's heart. One of the things that we talk about, and I wanted to touch on, is this whole issue of structural evil, systemic evil. When we can go back and we can look at slavery. Finally, if you remember the history here, the beginning, people, well, let's give the slaves new clothes. Let's make sure that the slaves have better food. Let's make sure that the slaves have better housing. Do you see all of this? But finally it was said, wait a minute, we have to attack the whole structure. The structure is evil. Now, we could have still been maintaining slavery, and I mean, I've heard people who have said to me, well, my family had slaves, but we treated our slaves good. You know? But still couldn't look at the system. And so when we look at these kinds of systems that are oppressive systems that keep people, that's justice. That's the pond idea of making sure the pond is open to fish in. And I want to share a recent experience that has just taken place in this whole piece that made it very obvious to me. And I look at our own systems here in America. We've dealt with, I know, the civil rights movement, but we're still needing to deal with systems, redlining, all of these kinds of things. These are systems that have to be dealt with in our own country regarding poverty. But recently, this is maybe a little more blatant that helps us maybe to lay that on and take a look deeper in our own systems here. As I mentioned to you regarding Sierra Leone, and World Hope has been very involved in Sierra Leone in a lot of areas. And we just finished getting through an free economic zone in Sierra Leone, which is the first ever in West Africa. And this had to do, we had a law firm in Washington that gave us over $1 million worth of pro bono work to be able to get this through. And so we have 50 acres of a free economic zone, which means no import tax, no export tax. It had to go through the parliament, the whole business, and try to get around the whole issues of corruption, et cetera. It's more complicated than I can explain to you on all of that. But the first factory that went in, and it was an Italian factory, is a fruit juice factory. And it's a mango juice factory. Now, if you've been to most of the countries in the world, you see mangoes that fall on the ground and rot because no one can get them to market or to do anything with them. So someone's been working with the farmers, 1,000 mango farmers, and working in co-ops to get these mangoes to the place. So, and then the factory hires about 100 people in the factory. The only way you could buy mango juice in Sierra Leone was it was canned and produced in Lebanon and brought into the country. This is the first factory in the country, and they will be doing export back to Europe, and as well as be able to buy it in the country. As a result of this whole kind of peace that just has taken place, and the ribbon cutting was last week, etc., there was a group from London who wanted to do energy in the country. And there's a dam there, and buy the dam, then buy the electricity, begin to electrify the whole country, and make it a public utilities so that the people owned it. Well, this is sort of up close and personal because my son is an attorney in Washington, and he's with the WilmerHale firm, and they hired the WilmerHale firm to do this, and so he was in Sierra Leone. Now, the folks in London thought, although John has been in Sierra Leone a lot, so he knew this was not going to be a short thing. The folks in London thought this is going to happen in 2 weeks. You'll get this signed in 2 weeks, and you'll be right back. Well, I want you to know he was there 6 weeks. But here is where you came up against the evil. I said, who are you competing with? He said, well, here's who I'm competing with. Owner of one of the mines, the diamond mines, And he had wanted to buy the dam for electricity for the mines, not for the people, saying a few things about it, made his money in the opiate trade, and had already promised a Chinese company that they would get all the iron ore out of the country for them, and he'd already paid big bribes. Minister of Energy had already been bribed. I mean, this all began to get uncovered. Didn't know this at the beginning, but as this happened, and I want you to know, as we prayed, these things began to become uncovered. Found out that the minister had been promised $1 million put in a Swiss bank account if he would not let anyone else get these contracts. That's when I'm talking about systemic evil, structural evil. Those are the things. Now, I want you to know that I went to a little prayer meeting. Baptists know about prayer meeting on Wednesday night, don't you? And I was at a little church in a prayer meeting on a Wednesday night. I'm sure those folks had never prayed about systemic evil. They'd prayed about grandma's toe and that it would rain or not rain. Because I worry that's about the extent many times of our praying. But I tried to explain to them that night what this was about. And they caught it. I think the Holy Spirit was there to help them understand. And that little prayer group prayed. I mean, we used to say a long time ago, they prayed heaven and earth together, kind of thing, or prayed heaven down, or all those terms that we've used in the past. But they prayed, and they got a new understanding of what it meant to pray regarding systemic evil, structural evil. Because I was thinking, okay, if this doesn't happen, now we'll continue to drill wells in this country, We'll continue to do economic development. We'll continue to do rural development. We'll continue to do all the kinds of things we do. But look at the oppression that would be lifted if the people had electricity. And they owned it. And they had a part, and they were empowered. Well, I would like to say it all happened that night, but it didn't. And it went on, and it was truly a battle. I began to think, not trying to get too charismatic here, but it was kind of like Daniel and the praying that Daniel was doing. The prayer was answered, but there was that fighting in between. It was almost in that realm. And I'm here to tell you that finally all of this began to become uncovered. And last Friday, a week ago, is this Thursday? Or whatever day it is. Anyway, a week ago, just last Friday, that was signed. The president signed it as an executive order, and it was signed and fired the Minister of Energy. Now, this is, when we're talking about, what we're talking about today is advocate. It's talking about to our Congress people, absolutely. But it's more than that if we're really going to get into this. And God will guide. God wants to be there. And our brother from South Africa certainly understands much of the structural kinds of things that they've worked with there. So my son got home Saturday night. He stopped in London to meet with his clients in London, and then came on home. And they said, well, we never dreamed it'd be this. They were going to be the big guys, sign this in 2 weeks, and if they don't sign it, come home. But my son, by the compelling power of God, wouldn't leave. He said, I'm leaving unless the president says absolutely no. I'm not coming home until this thing is signed. But I believe that in that process, it was the power of prayer. You know, God still can change the hearts and open up and reveal sin that is there. And this needs to happen in our own country as well, in many places. And as we're working at this, we do. Now, in my denomination, we've kind of lost that whole idea of advocacy. And we'd rather sometimes give the can of food instead of see what the issue is in the community. So in our denomination, our structure, we have district superintendents, which is like your middle judicatory leaders. So I am responsible for about 13 of them. So I called Chris Ann at Bread for the World and decided I'm going to get these guys, they're all men, get them to Washington, get them to understand. Now, they're all, I'm not in politics, but they're all pretty strong Republicans. So I told Chris Ann and Gary at Bread for the World, show every picture of Republican. Don't show any Democrats at all. And everything that you're going to do, show, so that it doesn't look as if they're being, well, I want you to know it was a wonderful day. And I brought, actually there were about 25 of us all together there. Bread for the World did a marvelous morning of training, folks, helping them understand. And at that time, we needed, now the word, I didn't realize this because I've been in Washington for all these years, but I didn't realize that the word lobby was a bad word. So I had to reframe that word for my district superintendents. And so lobby, we're not lobbyists, blah, blah. So I had to explain this is a biblical thing. We're doing advocacy. I went through the scriptures, the whole business. They got a sermon. So we got to Bread for the World. And they did a wonderful job. Gary and Chris Ann did a wonderful job of explaining what we were going to do, what this was, the biblical background, etc. And then they set us loose to go to Congress, to meet with our Congress people and senators. And it was an eye-opening experience. I know that when they came back, it wasn't all happy, isn't this a wonderful thing? They were processing a lot of things. But I want to tell you, Chris Ann and Gary, it's continued to process it. And I've worked with these people. They began to realize this is the work of God. Part of the thing that it was interesting, one of the district superintendents from one of the parts of Michigan, he had to wait to see the congressperson until the snowmobilers got out of the way. And it was hot that day. It was a hot April day and walking every place and lots of people. And he said, I realized in that day that a poor person in Grand Rapids would never be able to come up here. I was the voice. Suddenly they realized they were the voice for the poor. And the snowmobilers were ahead of them. And then our guy from Wisconsin, of course, the brewers, the brewery companies. He had to wait till the brewery companies got out of the way. And had to wait a long time. And he came back and he said, my goodness. And then he said he started going through in his mind the cities that he has churches in and the poor people in those cities and whatever. And look at all the power of the brewery and the money. They would never be up there to speak. So it became a very powerful experience for them to begin to understand what really advocacy really meant. And Bread for the World, and I'm not even on the board anymore, so I'm not here to promote something, except it's the best organization there is for the church to move through and work through to do advocacy and do advocacy for the poor. And I want to thank Gary and Chris Ann for their church relations piece that really helps us to do more than the letters. The offering of letters is great, but you do even more than that, really help us mobilize. I believe that there can be an exodus from hunger. And there's another piece that I think we need to take a look at when we talk about food. And that is food is also, as I've been around the world, food is also a transaction. And food can be a transaction for sex and for human trafficking for children. And that's another piece that enters into this, is that hunger, because if hunger is there to begin with, I will give you food and I will sell you. And I've watched this whole transaction happen. I don't want to integrate a whole lot of things in here, but this integrates into a lot of pieces. And when we get an exodus from hunger, we will see that we will have an exodus from a lot of other pieces of evil as well. I think Amos says it quite well when he says, "Let justice roll down like a river, and righteousness as a never-failing stream." That's the church as agent and advocate and bringing down structural evil. God bless you. I think we have time for questions and answers. Yeah. I realize that. Also, I did want to mention in your book, For the Health of the Nations, from the National Association of Evangelicals, where that, a bit of background where that came from. I'm on the executive for the NAE, but many years ago I was the head of the Social Action Commission. And so they kept making statements out of their government affairs office. That was before Galen was there. They kept making these statements, and I kept thinking, where are they getting this? I didn't agree with it. I guess that's why. You know. So I said, what's the grid you put this through for all these statements to be made? Well, they really didn't have a grid. They kind of had their own little political grid. So we had some changes, and so sometimes you can get things done when there are a lot of some changes in personnel. So in that process, then we invited Ron Sider and Diane Nippers to put together a whole piece, and there's a larger book that goes with this as a great study called Toward an Evangelical Public Policy, Toward an Evangelical Public Policy. And then this is the For the Health of the Nations is the compressed piece of that really has helped us now in our direction and to work through that. It's always a bit embarrassing. Michael Gerson and I are on an evangelical Catholic dialogue, and the Catholics have this, 2,000 years of social thought, and their compendium of everything is that thick, and it's just with numbers of where to find everything. And so I trot in with the little evangelical, little thin book, Well, I guess we haven't been thinking about this very long, So we need you all. But that's where that comes from. Yes.
JoAnne, I just wanted to comment and just say about when you all did come to Washington, that I was, two things, so moved by Pastor Isaac from
Yes, Dakota.
In 10 years, over 10 years of being with Bread for the World, I've heard many prayers about hunger and hungry people. I had never heard such a profound and compelling prayer. And it was from a place that, a depth that I just had never heard before. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I think we were also just moved by that experience and that interaction with your superintendent. So thank you for that.
He continues to grow, and he was probably one of those I was really worried about.
Exactly.
And it just, God just did something there.
It was a special moment.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing I wanted to say is that, no, I just forgot. You were talking about the For Health of the Nations. Wow. I think that's all that God wanted me to say.
Yes, Jason.
Thanks, JoAnne, that was a really good talk and inspiring as usual.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question about advocacy, and it's really inspiring to hear this history, especially from the Holiness Movement, because I'm now Pentecostal.
Oh, okay.
And sorry to my Reformed friends, but anyway, it's inspiring to hear this history and how the church was at the forefront of dismantling child labor and all these things. And then it's also exciting to hear about this awakening that's been happening. And people often will cite young evangelicals, of which I am one. as just not feeling like they have to choose between Jesus or justice. They just, that's who Jesus is, you know? But the question I have about advocacy is a lot of times I feel like the advocacy that is available is in some sense not dismantling the structures, but is just getting the government to do the feeding program. You know what I mean? So the church can have a food bank, and that's great, you know, dealing with that immediate need. And then the advocacy is to get the government to help pay for the food bank to give more food. And that's also great, but that's not actually getting at why that person's hungry. Do you know what I mean? So it's important advocacy, but it's not dismantling structures like you said. So I guess the question is just more of a reflection on, you know, how do we do that? How do we take that step? And who's doing that so I can meet them?
Well, I think advocacy includes dismantling the structures, or replacing the structures, or looking at the structures. It's all in one. But Peter, you want to speak to that? You're good.
No, I think you ought to. You know, as well as anyone here, a really good example of that in terms of blood diamonds and Sierra Leone, and what kind of systemic structure had to be dismantled and was dismantled, and a lot of people, some people in this room played a role in that. Maybe you could, from your background in Sierra Leone, could say a few words about that.
Well, regarding the Kimberley process,
yeah, exactly
yes,
so.
And Kimberley is a diamond company in Canada, and really was advocacy. That was what advocacy was in that. I mean, people just began to speak to that and began to get this thing unraveled until finally the diamonds became known as blood diamonds. I even marched in front of Tiffany's actually Tony Hall and I was kind of a high-powered one. We carried signs, a whole bunch of us, in front of Tiffany's in Chevy Chase. And blood diamonds, because they were, so it really meant literally taking on some of the big diamond companies in the world, and also found out that the diamond cartel is a very small group. They all go to Brussels, and it's only about a little over 100 different dealers that go out from there, and so began to tap those and find out where they were. And Tiffany's made an about change, and then started saying your diamonds were marked, whether they were pure and so forth. So go ahead.
No, that's exactly right. And I can remember the kind of dismantling that happened. There was I think you were part of this group too, but there was a group that went to Washington.
Yeah.
It was towards the end of trying to get the Kimberley Accords in place.
Yeah.
And the two holdout countries were Russia and the United States. Russia was holding out because they didn't want to tell the secrets about how many diamonds they mined. Their deal was secrecy. It was really tough to get through that, but they got through it, and they signed the Kimberley Accords. The United States was even tougher because at that time, and still, our big thing is free trade.
Yeah.
No restrictions on trade. And I can remember sitting there with Congress people and saying, look, the poor and the oppressed in Sierra Leone are paying for your free trade principle. And they came around. And they signed that, Republicans and Democrats, and passed the law that allowed the Kimberley Accords to be in existence in our country. And so we had the 34 countries that was needed to change how diamonds are marketed. And I believe that single action that maybe took 2 years and cost a couple $100,000, in terms of travel costs, saved the lives of significant numbers of people in Sierra Leone and bought them 10 years of peace to do exactly what you're talking about with a free trade zone. That could not have happened without peace.
That's right.
And that required a new way of marketing diamonds and a global agreement to do that. And we've got to tell those stories because the church was deeply involved, all the way from the little folks in Holland, Michigan that went to Zales and said, do you know where these diamonds came from? And can you tell me if they're not blood? Can you assure me they're not blood diamonds? And the guy goes to the back room and calls his head office and says, I've got the ladies group from the CRC in Holland, Michigan here, and they want to know about blood diamonds. And then suddenly the whole industry turned around and said, we're your allies now. It's an amazing story, and there's more like that every year.
Peter, that story doesn't get told a lot. And it's one, we need to talk to somebody about making a movie on it because it really does show how the little person in the church, the women's group in the CRC church in Holland, along with the president of Russia. You know, I mean, it's this whole. We do have power in the church to do this. It's exactly right. Yes.
We call it systemic evil when we see it in Sierra Leone and in the government there, but when do we look at our own government here at home and call it systemic evil right here? I mean, we can advocate, but we're still using that same system to advocate for others somewhere else. So when do we change that system here?
Well, I mean, I think those are, for example, with the civil rights movement, those were systemic evil issues that were dealt with, and we're still dealing with those regarding education. I mean, education in the inner cities. I mean, we're dealing with structural evil in those kinds of places here right now. And then, I mean, I think we need to look at why are people hungry in our country? Where are those systems that are continually holding people down? Why has it not changed as Scott showed last night? Why has it not changed in our country? As David, I think, mentioned, why has it not changed in our country as it has in other countries? And so what is holding that? What are those issues that are holding that? Yes.
Hi, my name's Valinda Bolton, and I'm with the Christian Life Commission. I served for 4 years in the Texas legislature, and I worked on a lot of issues, but not much on hunger, although I'd kind of peripherally, because of other work I'd done, been aware of the issue. But I've been working on this issue now on the lobbying advocacy side since getting defeated in November. And so I've learned more in the last month than I probably ever had learned. And I have not been doing food policy for 10 minutes compared to most of the people in this room. But I've learned some things about this structural injustice. I'm not ready to call it evil yet, but I've learned terms like food desert. And I learned this week that Texas leads the country in food deserts, both in urban and rural areas. We also, in Texas, have the lowest number of grocery stores per capita in the country. The lowest number of grocery stores per capita in this country. And so we're working to, and we have this generation of children. I have a 16-year-old who, thank God, is very healthy, but a generation of children who, for the first time in human history, have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. We have, for the first time in human history, a situation where obesity is linked to poverty, not wealth. So we're trying to say, well, let's do things to combat childhood obesity, and let's do things to make sure our kids are getting PE in schools, and let's do things to introduce healthy eating. At the same time, that we don't have stores where they can buy food in their neighborhoods.
Right, exactly.
And where the cost of fruit and vegetables is exorbitant compared to other things. And so we try to do things with food banks, and we try to do things with urban gardens, and we try to do things with farmers markets. And so we're doing all of these things as if they are individual issues. And we're not, or maybe somebody is, and I just haven't been around town long enough to see it yet, but we're not saying our children in America, in Texas, are dying. You know, Texas is part of the globe. So we don't have to go somewhere else to find work. Yeah, well, he said Texas doesn't always think it is. Okay, we are a whole nother country, but, you know, we are
really
still.
Thought that.
Yeah, right. We are our own. Yeah, well. So, you know, I just see so many things that are happening in terms of politics, in terms of suppressing voter turnout, we are about to cut, for the first time in 2 generations in Texas, we are about to not to fully fund public education. Okay, so what are the first things that are going to go? PE and healthy lunches. I mean, we try to divide these things up as if they're individual issues instead of stepping back and saying, when we go to the polls, what are we saying we want? When we look at these kids, what is our hope for our future if we don't raise them to be healthy and productive citizens?
Thank you. I think you've said it very well. Many of those are structural injustices or evil, whatever direction you want to call it. I was just in Detroit.
I like Charles Budd at HEB, so I'm not prepared to call it structural evil.
Okay.
So.
But I was just in Detroit a couple weeks ago right down 7 Mile. I went miles not finding one grocery store. You know, lots of check cashing places, exactly right, but not one grocery store. So I think, is the time up? Yeah, okay. Thank you all very much.